All right, now net zero. The Prime Minister does not want you to know the true cost of Australia's transition to net zero, and that's why he's reneged on his government's earlier commitment to release the new 2035 emissions targets before the election. Here's his Climate Minister, Chris Bowen, only a couple of months ago.
Let's just break down the 2035 target and the process. We're obliged to do that by next February, and of course we will.
Before the election, he says. The looming elections also why Labor's keeping its secret submission from you to the International Court of Justice in support of obligations by rich countries like us to meet climate targets and also to pay reparations to the supposed victims of climate injustice. Last year, the UN General Assembly requested the International Court of Justice to provide an advisory opinion on countries' obligations under international law to protect the climate and, quote, for future and present generations. It's about seeking clarity on the legal consequences for countries whose action or inactions, quote, have caused significant harm to the climate system and other parts of the environment. Now, does it surprise you to know that Australia co-sponsored this resolution? Doesn't me. And on December 3, so in a couple of weeks' time, Australia will make its oral submission to the court at The Hague in the Netherlands. We know that Australia's already made a written submission reinforcing, says our embassy, that, and I quote, climate change is the single greatest threat to livelihoods, security and the well-being of peoples of the Pacific, declaring that Australia recognises the importance of taking urgent action. Now, what concerns me here is Australia's written submission has never been publicly released. Now, rulings of the ICJ, they're not binding, but they are impactful and they cannot be appealed. For instance, it was an ICJ ruling on the return of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, including the vital Diego Garcia military base that the UK Labor government cited when it recently surrendered those islands and British sovereignty. Vanuatu, the country that's leading this case at the International Court, says that the re-election of Donald Trump and the United States' likely withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord makes the court's clarification of legal obligations even more important. Now, that's why we all need to know exactly what the Albanese government has told the court and exactly what its plans are, should it be re-elected, on emissions and on global climate action, given the potentially massive costs to consumers and taxpayers. Climate Minister Chris Bowen has just been at the latest UN COP Talkfest in Azerbaijan. In fact, he co-chaired the specific conference session on climate finance, or reparations, that rich countries are supposed to pay to developing countries, including China. China says the West owes $1.8 trillion every year, even though China's emissions in just the past decade exceed Britain's total emissions since the start of the Industrial Revolution. Now, this push from China was not agreed to, but the Bowen-chaired session did agree that wealthy countries would pay some $450 billion every year into this climate fund from 2035. A climate fund that China won't pay into, but will draw down from as a supposed developing country, even though China is the world's second largest economy and the world's biggest emitter. Now, can you believe this? And based on what the UN reckons are our climate obligations, that means we're on the hook for some $20 billion a year that the Albanese government has committed us to pay. A PM won't be specific, but that's the estimate, within a decade. Now, this is a racket, and we're best out of it. That's why it's so important this government comes clean now, before the election, on all its commitments on future emissions targets and future climate finance contributions and their costs. Now, if the Prime Minister won't tell us and help us understand why, it's because he doesn't want you to know the truth before the election. He doesn't want to shock you before you vote because he wants to get re-elected.